Thanks, Christopher, for the introduction. So like mentioned, I'm going to be talking about intuition factors. It's something I'm pretty excited about, and I'm happy to share it with everyone. So can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great, great. So we'll go ahead and get started. So before I jump into intuition factors, I want to talk about the rise of usability. It's something that I feel is going on right now and over the last few years. And there's two ads, just 1-minute TV spots that I think really highlight what I'm trying to get at when I say the rise of usability in kind of like the general public. So just to give you a little bit of information before I play the ad, it's a Visa checkout ad. And the first ad is a football player, Larry Fitzgerald. And essentially what he is doing is ordering something using a mobile phone while he's catching footballs. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, this ad.
Visa checkout is the easier way to pay online.
All set. Just enter your password and check out.
Thank you, Sean.
But can Larry Fitzgerald check out while catching passes from these guys?
After you.
Age before beauty. You mean rings first.
Hey, Butterfingers.
Who are you talking to? What is it, duck season? Hey, Larry, what are you buying? I got a little gift for you guys.
You buying Luck Eraser?
Nope.
Incoming.
Hustle, baby. Snow, really?
Here's some heat.
He did it! Order confirmed. 3 Larry Fitzgerald jerseys.
Signed by Larry Fitzgerald.
Sign up now. Visa checkout, the easier way to pay online. Visa, everywhere you want to be.
Okay, great. So I've got one more for you. And as you notice, they were really highlighting the fact that usability is very important for their app. So important that you could do it while catching a football. This is another example that's a little bit more extreme. So let's go ahead and check it out.
Looks like the whole ocean's like about to fold on itself when it's coming in. I think people get hurt every day out there.
Visa checkout is the easier way to pay online.
All set. Just enter your password and check out.
But can Kaloe and Dino really pay for pizza inside one of the heaviest waves in the world? Sign up now. Visa checkout, the easier way to pay online. Visa, everywhere you want to be.
Okay, great. So that was definitely a little bit more of an extreme example, being able to order pizza while on a surfboard. And so essentially what this is saying is that everyone wants usable software. And of course, everyone wants good design. But that has really always been the case. What I really mean by the rise of usability is that now everyone knows that they want usable software. They know that just because the app has certain features and functionality, it doesn't mean that the app is to their standards. And this is really the general public. So these ads out of BBDO in New York really take that to the extreme for Visa checkout. So definitely something I thought was very interesting. And kind of like along that note, there was a really good quote, and that kind of goes along the lines that design is becoming an essential element for creating a successful company. And that's from Yves Behar, who's an industrial designer. And there's a few different reasons why we're starting to see design become more prominent in terms of software development teams. And really, there's a whole discussion that could be made about the developer-designer relationship in software teams, and really how many designers there are versus how many developers there are these days. And so definitely something really really interesting to note. And so I'll go a little bit into my background. I work for a company called Flint, and we work with device manufacturers and retailers to create retail demo applications. We're based out of Redwood City, which is just about 30 miles south of San Francisco. And so there's kind of like a little star there for kind of just to kind of understand where we are exactly. This map tends to help people out. And to give you a little bit more detail, is that we build software that goes on devices when these devices are on display in stores, on retail shelves or end caps. Here's an example of kind of like one of our, our software is running on some of these mobile devices. This is an example in MediaMarkt in Berlin. And the application essentially does three things. The first thing it does is it runs a promotional video. Oftentimes this is a looping video. It highlights certain features of the phone, and it blocks users from, for example, entering their Twitter or Facebook credentials and walking away with that compromised. And then finally, it collects a detailed level of analytics on what the users are interested in and things like that. And here's another example of just kind of like a general retail shelf. This is promoting a pair of headphones, but you'll see that there's kind of like an embedded tablet next to the headphones that would essentially give you information about the device. And from a user experience standpoint, our goal as a retail analytics company building these apps is really to get people so excited about these end caps, these retail fixtures, that they want to line up just to kind of experience it. And so there are a lot of challenges that we're faced with. One being that, if we're creating for example, an Android app, we don't know exactly who the user is as they kind of approach that tablet. And so a lot of times we have iOS users that are interested in Android phones. And so what we have to do is we have to find a balance between the standards and the human interface guidelines of what an Android app should be, but we have to kind of stretch that a little bit to allow people that are coming from either feature phones or a different operating system such as iOS to really understand the operating system that we're designing for. Although I will say that it's happening a lot less and less, that there's a difference between these operating systems, and there are a lot of standards out there. So that has made at least our job a little bit easier. And so let's jump right into intuition factors. Christoph gave you kind of just like a really brief introduction to it. What are intuition factors? And so a good way to jump into intuition factors is to really define intuition. So what is intuition? So, excuse me, a great, these are two definitions for intuition, and really it's what you feel as a designer, as a developer, as someone that is creating the architecture of whatever it may be, what you feel to be true in your gut feeling. And there's several different reasons why people do this or justify their designs or their decisions, and it's really based off of intuition. And it's really the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. And so it's important to note here that intuition is subconscious. And so it's especially true for mobile for a variety of different reasons. And so why might you think, maybe we can get some involvement from the audience, why might you think that it's especially important for mobile to have intuitive app design? Anybody? Right, exactly. So, okay, so learn how to use it. Any other reasons why mobile might be a little bit more important than web? Right, so if you're catching footballs, you might need to more quickly, for example, learn how to perform a specific function or task. And also real estate. We have a lot smaller of a space to work with. And we're very limited on what we can show and what we can teach the user. And so it's definitely especially true for mobile. But it's important to note that user interface design and the entire user experience design process is and should be based on part data and part intuition. And so this is where a lot of other designers disagree. And so they might say that design should be 100% data driven. data-driven design. If we have the data, then we could find the perfect design. And there are other designers that think, you shouldn't involve data at all. You should have testing at the end of the process, but you shouldn't let data influence the artwork or the design or whatever it may be. Where I feel it's really one part data and one part intuition. And so today, this talk will kind of go over that part of intuition. And so we'll briefly go into a little bit of what is data. And so let me actually back up real quick. So when you think of data for a mobile application, and you're designing a mobile application, you have a set of data. What kind of data might that be? Any examples? Okay, so I'll go back to the slide. So it might look like A/B testing. It might look like any type of user research results, heat maps. We could even go as far as to say that bugs or software issues can be considered data points that are used when developing or designing software. And of course, it's all about numbers, statistics, and so it's really what I mean here by data is it's really any type of data that you have. And so it's really a balance between, again, data and intuition. And I'll skip this slide. And so I have an example here. This is the current Facebook landing page. And so users who do not have a Facebook account will see this when they go to Facebook.com. And I was speaking to a designer at Facebook. And this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago that he was working there. And he was telling me that they had a landing page and they were running dozens of tests on a weekly basis to see how do we get more conversions out of this page. And after these dozens of tests, they were able to improve the conversion rate of the page by 2 to 3%. And so when this designer came in, he took a look at it and he said, okay, I know what data I'm looking at, but I'm going to scrap this and I'm not going to look at the data. I'm going to design this how I think it should be designed. So he redesigned this page, and after he redesigned it without kind of bringing in the data, they tested it, and whereas before they had a 2 to 3% increase, they now had an 8 to 10% increase in conversion. And the designer created that new design based off his intuition, and he took a big risk to do that. And so designing off of intuition is very, very risky, but a lot of times those risks pay off. And so you're looking at that 8 to 10% increase in conversion rates, and then you could even optimize further with the data points, for example, that you had before. So it's definitely important to really keep keep intuition as part of the design process. And again, I really can't stress enough that it is one part data and one part intuition. So the intuition factors are broken up into 4 different sections, and these sections are created in a very loose manner. And so one thing I want to mention is that a lot of the examples that we're going to be going over today are interchangeable. And so we might see something for learned usability that could be in the category of perceived usability or experience-driven intuition factors. And so it's really interesting to take a look at this and see how many different facets it could be categorized into. And so the first factor is a personal instinct factor. And it really comes down to the point that, despite what I know about the design, despite what I know in terms of the data points, what seems right to me as a designer? And there was a really good example about chat. And so this is an example for the web, but it's essentially saying that, and Olark is a company that has been able to implement chat services into very many websites. It's a great tool. And here's an example. You could see the kind of like the chat window they have at the bottom right. And actually, Christopher was telling me about a company that implemented a chat feature. And here's actually it's a Polish company that's selling a product that's a very specific product. It's like a medical product. And what he was saying is that they didn't have the chat feature originally. And when the designer made the decision, the intuitive decision, to put that chat feature in there, they saw a 40% increase. Now that's pretty huge, especially when you're talking about conversion of an actual product. And so that was a risk that that designer took to put in that chat feature, and they saw a huge increase from that. And there was really no way that with the existing layout, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but there was no way that with the existing layout that they could have had those tests that say we need that chat feature. It's something that kind of came in from the intuition standpoint, that intuition side of things. And so that I feel is a very good example of personal instinct. So what feels right to me as a designer? So the next example is experience driven. And I want to mention that when designers are working on development teams, it's very important to be able to justify the design decisions that you make. And so if I want to have a design element that's blue versus green, there really has to be a reason as to why I want it to be blue, other than the fact that maybe I like blue. So in a very basic form, there should be a reasoning for every single design decision that is made. And for that reason, because of that, a lot of times the designers are having discussions with the development team, and the development team really needs to be persuaded why something should be a certain way. And here's an example of what I would call an experience-driven intuition factor, is that when we're looking at a standard web view, at the top left of the web view, we typically have a back button. And at the top right of, mobile view, we have kind of a next or a save or a done button, something that advances you forward. And this is not explicitly written in the human interface guidelines, but it's something that you can take a look at and say, okay, so the top right moves me forward, the top left takes me back. That seems like a pretty straightforward idea, but how do we justify this? And so the experience-driven intuition factor essentially says that with experiences that you've had in the past, like let's say I could say, in the past I've made this decision for one mobile application, and now that I'm applying the same ideology to this mobile application, my experience in the past has been successful, and that is why I feel like this is correct. And you might have a lot of justifications that carry over from that past experience, and again, the intuition factors are loosely drawn out. And so this is an example of what I would call an experience-driven intuition factor, something that has worked for me in the past. And so the next one is learned usability. And so this intuition factor is kind of explained in that what has become a standard within the software user base. And the example we're using here is the hamburger button. And the hamburger button has quite a bit of there's a strong argument for or against it. I've had a couple of these discussions already in the last couple of days, being at a mobile conference. So here are two examples. One is from Facebook on iOS, and one is from GoDaddy on iOS. And in many ways, the hamburger button was originally kind of brought into the mainstream general public and popularized with one of the original Facebook applications. They ended up pulling that, and but the hamburger button is essentially still there, and it's there in the tab bar. As you can see, those three lines, and the word more is written underneath. Essentially, just the more button. iOS kind of dictates this as like the three dots, right? And over here on GoDaddy, it's kind of like the more traditional view is what we think of the hamburger button. And essentially, the hamburger button is essentially just a menu, more details, menu, right? And so it's used here, and it's not something that was originally created from any human interface guideline. It's something that essentially became a standard within the software user base. it's interesting to look at this, and there was a study done. I would have to pull up the details about it, but essentially they had the hamburger menu icon, and they tried just the 3 lines, and then they tried another variation with the 3 lines and then the word menu underneath, and then they took out the 3 lines. They took out the 3 lines and they just had the word menu. And what they saw, that if you were under the age of, I think it was like under the age of 40, then you knew exactly what those 3 lines were. But if you were over the age of 40, you actually never tapped on that button, and you were more likely to tap on the one that actually spelled out the word menu. And that changed over the course of the study. I think it was like a 2-year study, and so that changed over the course of the study. And so it was really interesting to take a look at that and really see how this icon has really become a standard within the software user base. And so this is an example of learned usability, and I have an Android example to show you in just a second. But I also want to mention a very important user experience design element, and that's looking at learnability versus usability. Just because something is not immediately intuitive at the start is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, there's a learning curve on some things. I guess the best example that I could think of is Salesforce. I don't know if any of you use Salesforce, but if you are using Salesforce for the first time, you probably won't be able to do much for a couple days at least. There's quite a bit of a learning curve. There's quite a bit of a setup process. And it's a really good example of learned usability, because once you get to the point where you've set it up just the way that works for you and your organization, it's actually a very usable tool. I don't know if it's the best user experience, but that is a really good example of learned usability. And so learned usability is not necessarily a bad thing. And we're looking at mobile, learned usability should actually have a very small learning curve. And if we're looking at a menu like this, I might not know what those 3 lines and then the more button, let's say that, on the Facebook app, I might not know exactly what that is immediately, but after I tap on that, I'm going to know. And so the next time I go into the app, and I'm going to know what's going to be behind that tab after I tap on that item. And so learnability versus usability is very important, and that kind of falls into the intuition factor learned usability. And so here's the Android example. And so this is the Google Hangouts app on Android. Excuse me, and you can see that we have those 3 lines, and this is a little bit more of the traditional sense. Once you tap on those 3 lines, then you get kind of like a sidebar menu, and then we have the segmented controller there. And so these standards don't just stay within one operating system; they carry over to other operating systems as well. So this was a little bit more of a popular example, but there are a lot of different examples of learned usability that we would be able to kind of go through. And again, they could be interchanged. We could look at this example on Facebook, and we could assume that the Facebook designers, they were taking the experience-driven usability, or experience-driven intuition factor, and they could say, okay, this has or has not worked in the past, so we're going to change this moving forward. And so a lot of these are definitely interchangeable. Excuse me. So the last example here is perceived usability. And so this intuition factor is explained as, what do I think the user will do in this scenario? So I worked for a company that created an application for parents that had kids. I don't have kids of my own, so it was really interesting to try to put myself as a designer in the mindset of another type of user. In this case, it would be a user that's a parent. And as designers, we have to do this quite a bit. We have to put ourselves in the shoes, in the mindset of someone else, of another user. And what this intuition factor essentially says is, what do I think the user will do, the parent, in the scenario of using this application? Or if the kids are also interacting with this type of application, what do I think the kid will do in this scenario? And so the example I have here is Snapchat, and this is actually something that we were discussing and implementing into the app for the parents as well, because the children did interact with it as well. And essentially it's saying, if a child is looking at a photo, what are they interested in doing to that photo? And a lot of the answers come out to is interested in drawing on that photo. And so if you use Snapchat and you love drawing, it doesn't mean you're a kid. But essentially, as a designer, we look at that and we think, okay, what is our demographic? What is our age group? And what do we think that age group will do when we cannot be in that age group or that demographic? And so this is the perceived usability intuition factor, which I think is definitely one of the most interesting and very similar to the personal instinct intuition factor, which is what feels right to me as a designer. And of course, and so here are the intuition factors, kind of the 4 intuition factors that just a quick recap. And it's important to note that these are confirmed with data. And again, these are just very general data points. And so you apply the intuition factors, and then you go back and you apply user testing. And it's very important to do as much testing as you can, as long as you have the time, you can afford to do it. But in terms of design and implementation, you take those risks with intuition, and then you confirm with data. And so that's it for intuition factors. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the next 15 minutes up to discussion. So if you have any questions, or if you want to discuss more examples or any examples, let's go ahead and do that now. And here's my contact information. So thank you.
Okay, and here's the first announcement that I were going to make at the beginning, that we are recording. So if you have any questions, please ask for a microphone so that we can record your question and the answer. So now we've got 15 minutes with Alex. Any questions here?
Hi. It's okay. First of all, thanks for the great speech. My question is talking about intuition. You could, when you're designing cross-platform apps, an app that a user might use on a desktop, then Android and iOS, would you rather think about making the experience seamless within the app, or would you rather try to make it seamless within the ecosystem? That is, make it as other iOS apps, as other Android apps on subsequent platforms?
Right. It's a very good question. And so the experience, I guess the quick answer to the question would be, I feel like there's a balance. So it's a little bit of both. And so you definitely want to have a consistent experience across all platforms. But you do that with keeping the guidelines of the operating system in place. And so a lot of times designers run into the issue that they started on Android and now they want to have a very similar experience on iOS. And so they'll put the tab bar at the top for iOS, and definitely not a standard. So you want to keep the experience similar as possible, but you want to kind of conform, at least to some extent, to the guidelines of the operating system. And some apps, Snapchat is a great example, kind of take that to the next level, in that they really simplify everything, that they don't really have a lot of, they're not really dependent on the guidelines of the operating system because they have a very unique experience. And so they can tailor their application in a more seamless way. But it's always a balance, and you definitely want to conform. And it's not good to have something that looks like one operating system on another operating system or whatever it may be. So hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, hello. I have a question: how to deal with usability of functions that are not using so often, like hamburger button. So.
Okay, so how to improve the usability of features and functionality that are not commonly used?
Yeah.
Okay. So the quick answer to that would be testing. And so a lot of times, if you do user research with your existing user base, you might not have a lot of data on that particular feature. But it's in that scenario, it would be great to, for example, set up user testing sessions, focusing on, think of it like unit testing for design and features. And so essentially isolate that feature that you want to test, and then collect the data that way. And so again, it's going to be a part intuition, part data. As a designer, you will know what the feature should feel like, what it should do. But in terms of the data sense, if you're not collecting a lot of data from your existing user base, definitely kind of focus on that feature and then run tests around that feature would be my suggestion. So does that answer your question? Okay, follow up.
Maybe when we have, for example, security settings, we don't often use it, but in some application we just want to find it, but we don't know where to find it. So I know how to deal with, as a designer, how to say the user where is it, or.
I see. Okay. So in this case, even though it's a setting that is not going to be frequently used, it should still be accessible if the user needs to access it. And so, aside from running tests and finding out which is the best way to get there, I think that the correct answer is more of like, how do you prioritize these lesser used features? And I think that if there's a feature that's in your application, that you should never hide any type of feature. And even if it's a setting, for example, let's say it's changing username or password. It'll be very rare that the user needs to do this, but it is still very important to make it easily accessible for the user to know, okay, how do I change that feature? And if a great example of this is if you think of certain applications that are commonly used, and you think, how do I change my password in this application? And I might have never changed my password in this application before. Let's say, for example, Dropbox. Using the mobile app, I have kind of an estimated view of how I'm going to go in and change that. Now, if I kind of try to change it and realize I can't, then that would be a usability issue, is that even though it's a lesser known feature, if I try to do something and I can't do it, I would say that's a problem. And then this opens up another discussion, is that should we have certain features like settings or changing your password in a mobile application, or should we push users to the web? And so this is definitely a big discussion. I feel that something like changing a password should be able, you should be able to do it on a mobile device. But again, it depends case to case. So, okay, great. Any other questions? Okay, great.
Okay, I've got one. How do we enhance our intuition? Like you said, the intuition is very context-based. How do we gain intuition when we change environment? For example, if we design for other country or other age group.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily a way to improve the intuition, because it's really kind of like what that gut feeling is. But if you're looking at a different demographic, doing research on that demographic will definitely help you get in the mind of that demographic. And so, for example, the perceived usability. If I'm working with children aged, I guess like let's say 8 to 10. If I learn about what children aged 8 to 10 are doing, then I'll have a better idea of, okay, what are the common apps that they use? Like, are they familiar with these features? Are they familiar with those features? And so definitely do research on the demographic, but essentially intuition should just be not something that you seek to improve, but just immediately how you feel and what you feel. And to become a better designer would really try just to kind of help you understand what your user is thinking. But again, that won't affect the personal instinct intuition factor. It'll affect the perceived usability intuition factor. So, which actually is a really good point, is that some of these factors can be, I guess, improved upon in different ways. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great.
So that, on, I guess, the flip side of the intuition piece, right? Like everybody sort of has intuition. I would say not all intuition is created equally, right? And for designers, it seems sometimes there can be with something like intuition, you don't necessarily have a justification or an explanation to back it up, right? So maybe you design something and a higher up or somebody that has a little more say in the situation, but is not necessarily a designer, may have questions about, well, why would you do it this way, or why did you choose to do it that way? So I'm curious if you have any suggestions for ways to back up something like intuition, where you don't necessarily have maybe the data the first time to explain how you got there.
Yeah, so this brings up a really good point, and that's that when we say intuition, are we explicitly saying the intuition of the designer, or what we feel is intuitive to the user? And this is something that actually can be used to elaborate on intuition factors. But I guess I'll answer your question in two different parts. And so the first is being, what do I think will be intuitive to you? And that is something that you would be able to justify by saying, you are commonly using these types of features in your current product tools or workflow, and so implementing similar features or items will be intuitive to you, for example, a very generic example. And then we have the other view that's, what do I feel as a designer is intuitive? And then we could break that down to the personal instinct or the experience-driven factors. And so for the personal instinct, it's really is like, if I felt like that button should be here, why is that? And so I feel like you should still be able to justify why you feel that something is right. And when a designer might say that, I just thought it looked good, or something like that, it's kind of like an answer that you really need to elaborate on. So it's tough because it's a subconscious reasoning, but at the same time, you have to kind of go back and justify, analyze, and this is where the data comes in, analyze why you feel that that's the method that you chose. And so that's definitely a very interesting thing to think about. So, right.
Okay, we've got time for the last question.
I would like to ask you about tutorials when you start your application for the first time. If some of our features are complicated, should we use and create these tutorials, or only depend on the user's intuition?
So this is definitely a great question. And typically what we see is we see tutorials that are like guidelines. A lot of times these are overlays. And then we have, kind of going back to when you think of the traditional like Microsoft application, it takes you through a wizard. And a lot of the mobile apps these days kind of like take you through a wizard to get set up. I much prefer the term walkthrough because it kind of takes you step by step. Wizard has a really bad connotation to it. But I think that for some of the advanced features, it's totally fine to have walkthroughs or tutorials. And then this kind of goes along the lines of learnability versus usability, is that although it's not immediately obvious what you need to do, the user will learn over time, with hopefully a short learning curve, that this is how they need to do it. So for tutorials that you kind of show one time, I think that's totally fine. And for walkthroughs that you have every time you're setting something up, depending on the case, that's also fine. If you're setting up a configuration for the first time, like an account, for example, then having several steps and kind of walking you through it, I think is fine, because it's something that's advanced, it's complicated. We still want to do it on a mobile device, but we are allowing the user to kind of perform that functionality, and I would say it's totally fine. So I think that the biggest mistake that a designer could make is showing this tutorial, and then the user has to keep going back to that tutorial and realize that the learning curve is a little bit too high to display it in that way.